we will discuss about railway and free market. In Spanish, we say this is an oxymoron. It's impossible. Conceptually, there are two activities which are impossible to connect. It is said that railways is a system which is a natural monopoly, which is impossible to be changed. We'll see that it's not easy, but it's possible and maybe convenient to get for a different system which would avoid this monopoly. To go ahead, okay. I will talk, first of all, that all what I will say is explained in this book I have written 1 or 2 years ago. This book relates, 20% of this book is relating about regulation, and especially the European regulation. And I have write on this book possible solutions. We will analyze how can we obtain these possible solutions. First of all, several words about railways, because if you are not familiar with this system, need one introduction. This introduction will spend, I have spent 3 slides to explain it, are about logistics. First one is logistics. The first information you have to keep in mind is that railways has been a system which has misused in the past, and has survived as it could survive in the 20th, but probably in the 21st century it will be massively used. In the 20th century, the dream has been to go point to point, by car or by truck. On the 21st, unfortunately, we will not continue with this idea, because it's too difficult for the massive congestion of the cities, I explained this in detail, to continue with this. It will be necessary to use the multimodal systems, not in America, not in America, but probably in Europe or in many countries of Asia. Reasons of this is that the spending in energy of the railway diminish dramatically the use of energy in compared with the road. To give you an idea, one container going through a rail spends 5 times less energy than at this container going by truck. 5 times. And for passengers, the ratio depends on several other factors, but is between 30–35% less. The energy expended by train is 25% more or less, 30, sometimes 35, of the energy expended by passenger kilometer by car. But probably the most important point which obliges to use the train in the future is that the population of the world has grown dramatically. 60 years ago or 70 years ago, we were half part of the population that it exists now. But this is only the surface or the face of the problem, because behind there is one bigger problem, is that the population concentrates in large cities. And nowadays, more or less, 45% of the population lives in big cities, in large cities. And there are also problems on contamination, on pollution, but I will not refer about this. Another thing to keep in mind, infrastructure. We have seen one nice picture from Mr. Terceiro about the wealth at night. We have seen lights in large cities. Really, what happens today is that the world has become an enormous network of large cities, normally megapolis, which compete among them in order to attract capital, investment, and brains. These megapolis, these large megapolis, need three infrastructures. The one infrastructure is devoted to connect different megapolis, which need aircrafts or high-speed trains, depending on the distances. Another thing which these megapolis need is internal vicinity connection. Metro, rail, there are different systems, but we need that these large megapolis, especially if the density, not like in America, where the density is very small, but when the density is big, it's difficult to connect these megapolis, and then we need trains, railways systems. And finally, transport of goods, freight. The freight is in third place on this slide, but it would be the first, because the freight is the most important business which exists in the railway systems. Now we start to discuss in our topic. Until 1970, there was necessary a simple network track, a simple network. We will explain this in detail. But in those days, the same track was used for freight and passengers. And the power was coal, oil, or single voltage lines. Single voltage lines, maybe it is not well explained, is that when using electrical energy for railways, one specific voltage of the ¿cómo es diu catenària? Sorry, my English is very bad, as you know, but what I mean is that to get electricity from the catenària was the same kind of electricity for all the different systems. However, since 1970s, we need not only one track, but three different tracks to connect cities. Lines connecting megapolis use normally high-speed trains, which have 25,000 volts in alternate electricity. Vicinity passengers needs lower electricity and in continuous power, and freight cargo needs a strong tracks in order to resist the weight of this wagon. So we are in a transition period going from this single track for all kind of trains to a triple different lines which are needed nowadays. Then we start about the problems or opportunities to get a single market for, a free market for trains, for railways. There are several facts against the possibility to combine the two concepts, the free market and railway systems. The first one is that in order to have free market, it's necessary to have a large number of operators on both sides, from suppliers and buyers. It is difficult to get this system in our business. Another problem is that it is needed a large investment. Large investment is not easy to create when in any sector it is needed. A large investment is not easy to create many actors. External influences. Not to mention that the railway system is full of external influences. City planning, it's crucial. The problems of the city plannings or the plannings on the earth are an objection. Electrical supply, security, safety, and not to mention independence of political believing. This is normal. The politician people know that massive ways to move people needs control or needs to be planified or things like that. These are enemies of the free market in this activity. But the main enemies are unknown. It seems not important, but I will explain you that it's very important to have a clear way to control the performance of the systems. For example, to know which would be the period of destruction of one track according to the weight of the locomotives or the wagons who across this track. It is needed to get free market to have a symmetrical information from both sides, from the suppliers and to the buyers. And it is also necessary to obtain a flexibility of the price against the performance, to get a system where the cheap and expensive prices correspond to a better service or a better conditions. All these things, these three last things, way to control performance, symmetrical information, and flexibility, are impossible to be obtained if we don't have a complete technical standardization of the product. And what happens in our business is that the standardization don't exist. You remember that there are a lot of markets where the client is prisoner of the supplier because of technical reasons. If you want to change one mechanism of the machine manufactured by Siemens, you cannot go anywhere because the system is particularly down, and this is one simple mechanism would be impossible to be changed. To make prisoner the market from large suppliers is something against the free market. And in the railways business, this is still now, even now, one of the problems we have. So these are enemies of the possibility to get free market with the railway system. There are several problems, several typical mistakes when we discuss about this. We discussed it before that the free market works properly in America. In America, we have one successful system, which is the free market for cargo. It's so strong, the success of America, that this system in the States has across the border of Canada and Mexico, and nowadays they have a single network in all North America where the system is regulated, organized, works properly, but only for cargo, not for other means of railway systems. Another typical mistake is to discuss that in UK the privatization has worked properly. I don't enter in the discussion if in UK the system works or not properly. But I remember you that in UK, the system consists only in a vicinity, a large, big vicinity system. They don't need, almost don't need, long distances, maybe one vertical axis, and they don't need cargo systems because for multimodal purposes, to transport containers from one part to another in UK needs the first and the last mile made by truck, and in the middle we can use the sea, which is cheaper in energetic system, in energetic terms than the railway. So well, we can discuss about this, but I have to advance. I will not talk about the problem of privatizing and bureaucratic and things like that, which will be discussed later on. But there is one mistake which is bigger, is that we try to solve the problem taking into account the past years. And what would happen is that nowadays we are in a big change of the railway system. And we have to think not what has happened in the past, but what is going to happen in the future. The new paradigm is that the first stage of the train happened on the first 100 years of the product. Is when the train was with the locomotive where the machines were powered by steam. One simple track, nothing else. The second stage was electrical system. It started more or less in 1930, and up to 1970, we used electrical power, simple electrical power to move locomotives. But in the 1970s, the revolution came. Remember that the container, somebody of you know when the container was invented?
After World War II.
It was invented in Korea, but used for first time for civil purposes in 1967 in San Francisco, on the harbor of San Francisco. Once the container appeared, in few years, 2 or 3 years, the container expanded everywhere, and it changed from the cargo to multimodal, because the container allowed to use trucks, trains, and even aircrafts. Of course, ships. But this was not the most important change that happened there, because in 1970, we get computers, electronics, communication with satellites, etc., which make much easier, especially Mr. Joan Torres knows electrical, la electrónica de potencia, the potential electronics, which changed absolutely the power of the machines, etc. So in 1970, the train changed at all the perspective. And now we are when the multimodal systems, the congestion of the cities, and the energy needs new solutions to the train. So these four steps of the matter change completely the logics on everything, the technique, the competition, the regulation, etc. And now we are changing the situation. So the facts who work in favor to move to free market for railways are first that monopolistic systems has failed. In Europe, we have an example that not only Spain or other countries, but also Germany are unhappy with the railway system they have. They are unable to continue progressing. I have to say that this has been discussed before, that the European Commission has pushed to merge all the systems in Europe, and the failure is also absolute. So, defenders of the existing systems are convinced that they cannot solve the problem. Now, as I explained before, we are in a big change for the future, which would change absolutely all premises we had. And when these changes occur, like now, it's time to look for new ideas in order to change the problems we have and we are unable to solve. This is for sure that has to come from the triangle of regulation, which is a word which don't like in this audience, but it's necessary because somebody has to make the referee between the one who rents the line and the one who buy the line in order to move the train. We need a referee. So the regulation probably is needed, not probably, for sure is needed infrastructure, and is needed operation, companies who operate it. These three kind of companies have to work on the solution. So, to find solutions needs to take into account this new paradigm, the fourth stage of the train, needs analyze and discover which are the traits that has worked against the evolution of the train, and this is prospective. My position on this book is that the first thing we have to do is to improve the standardization. Improving the standardization would work in favor of the regulation and finally to introduce competition. And we have to go deep on the triangle of regulator, infrastructure and operator. So recommendations are standardization. Secondly, independence of the triangle. Independence means that the regulator, the companies who build infrastructure, and the companies who transport, who operates the railways, the trains, have to be independent, no connections among them. And these no connections includes not revolving door between employees of these three different elements, which in Spain, at least in Spain, is very an habit which is massively extended. So for the situation now is that the regulator, the company who owns the infrastructure, and the operation company in Spain, ADIF, Renfe, and the ministry are the same people, more or less. And they are monopolies on these three cases. One possible evolution would go in order to maintain the regulator as it is, to accept that for a time being the infrastructure will continue like it is, and to introduce that the operation would be open to competition. Only operation. And all operations. Probably the first one, what the European Commission has recommended, is to start for freight. In a second step, expand this operational competition to all kinds of activities, and this would be one of the ways to continue progressing. The third possibility is to maintain the regulation on one hand, and to allow that not only the operation but also the infrastructure would be introduced to a competition. There are several ideas which work on this thing, especially in freight, taking into account that this infrastructure is not only the lines, which is the first thing we think about this, but also the stations and the storage of the terminals of the lines. It is the main problem we have now, for example, in the Corredor Mediterranean in Spain, which everybody of you know what happened there, is that the terminals for freight are not defined. This is the first thing which maybe would be necessary to pass to the private initiative. And finally, another possible picture of the future would be the total competition in everything. I think that regulation would be very difficult. So, analysis of the solution that the first stage, the bureaucratic one, is not working. It's a complete disaster. That it's likely, probably, that the first step would be to make the competition on the operational side, and then we can continue on this way. This is something which is open for discussion with you, but to be realistic, I think is the only thing we can do. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organization for the invitation to be here today and talk to this audience, and congratulate the initiative of this roadshow to bring the voice of the freedom of the free entrepreneurship to different cities around Europe, to different cities around the world. This is what we need from time to time: fresh air, new ideas, benchmarking. And talking about benchmarking, we come across to Austria. I am afraid that I have to say some words about Austria, a small country, 8.3 million inhabitants, and Austria has the same exports to Spain as Spain has the same figure of exports to Austria. And like this, everybody's happy. And sometimes you listen, you hear the authorities say, oh, this year we will be reaching the same level of exports to Austria as they import to us. Yeah, that's very nice. But nobody says that Spain is eight times bigger. So Austria, being a small country, has an economy which is exporting and having activities in all countries. And in this aspect, it will probably be very interesting to analyze the transport system, the railroad system of Austria, because a good number of their goods have to trespass their frontiers, and probably they have a very efficient railroad system. Although in Austria they don't have any AVE. They don't have, as far as I know, they don't have any high-speed railroad system for persons. And maybe they don't want to pay that. Or maybe they don't want to debt themselves for such monumental constructions. But going back to the presentation of Mr. Montero, which is extremely interesting and precise and well documented, it comes to the conclusion that if the railroad system is not competitive, someone is going to do this job. And who is going to do this job? The truck system, the truck delivery, which is probably what has been happening here in Spain, where lorries, trucks are the ones so far transporting the goods place to place. So obviously there is a lot of things to do here to improve the situation and to make this sector more competitive. Because we cannot forget that today everything travels, everything moves. A company in the automotive sector imports spare parts, and then with these spare parts they produce cars, and these cars inevitably will also travel abroad. So in our economy, there is a big component in the logistic cost that had to be, of course, improved. Good, and I think that at this point I will stop my words, and I will, Lawson will continue, and after I will be able just to interact a little bit with you, that maybe if railroad does not work, goods will be transported by lorries, will be transported in the rivers, or maybe transported also by plane. Up to you. Eh? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So when I was a small boy, my father collected toy trains. I don't mean little trains, I mean trains that were about this big. You set them up, and they made noises, and they blew smoke. But the problem was a significant one. You see, he kept all these trains at the very top of our house in the attic. But the only way to get to the attic was through my bedroom. And so inevitably, at midnight, or 1 o'clock in the morning, or 2 o'clock in the morning, I would be asleep. And the door would open, and my father would try to sneak into my room, carrying boxes of trains to take them to the attic to store them. This meant for about 15 years of my life, I never got sleep. And because of that, I really hated trains. And so I find it ironic that decades and decades later, I arrive in Barcelona and discover I'm to talk about trains. So my father is getting revenge. Anyway, The reality is that Mr. Montero is certainly more of a train expert than I am. But my interest in discussing trains, or frankly any transportation structure, is that the principles and the economics of a free enterprise, free market system still apply to the challenges facing trains that they do to many other infrastructure. In order to understand that, we need to be reminded of a couple of key important points about economics that relate not just to trains and the challenges of deregulation of free enterprise, but to other industries as well. And the first, of course, is price. Because price we often think is something that simply we pay for a commodity. But price is really nothing more than a signal. It's just sending information about how a system is working. And that means it can mask things and it can sometimes unmask things. And you don't know what's in a price. I remember the very first time I sold a house. And the woman who sold my house I said, well, my house is worth this much. And she said, no, it's not. It's worth what the next person will pay it. That's what it's actually worth. It's a reminder about what price means. Secondly is, what are subsidies? Subsidies are another way of informing and controlling price. They, of course, are dictated by government and in many different ways. And there are many subsidies that many people that we all agree with, we'd support, and there are many that people would disagree with, from supporting the police and the military to welfare to manipulating the economy. But the point being that they still mask the true price. And then the third important lesson that relates to trains and other things is that governments actually never choose outcomes. They would like to choose outcomes, but what they really do through regulation and through law is choose what we call rules of the game. They simply set up the rules in a certain way. And those rules create incentives or they create disincentives. And how people and how institutions react to those is actually what determines the outcome. It may be what was intended, but often it may not be. Those kinds of lessons have been seen in the United States, as you referred to, especially in freight. But prior to 1980, the freight system in the United States was actually a very similarly highly regulated, highly controlled industry at various times throughout US history. It was always worse during times of World War I and World War II in particular. But in 1980, something was passed called the Staggers Act, which completely deregulated the freight industry in a couple of very important ways. The most important was that they allowed single operators to both own the tracks as well as to own the stocks. And so it became a system where one company or two controlled more of the aspects of the freight industry. And what has happened, as you alluded to, is that the freight industry in the United States has both become significantly cheaper, accidents have gone down, and it's become much more efficient for employees who work within the rail industry. And more importantly, the rail companies invest about $500 billion of their own money back into the infrastructure without much subsidies at all. But what that same act did was it created a subsidized commercial train known as Amtrak. Amtrak exists all over the United States, but it predominantly functions in that corridor between Washington, D.C. and Boston, between Philadelphia and New York, which of course is a large population center. Amtrak, the U.S. government spends $1.5, $1.6 billion a year. It is, however, not used very often, even by those of us that live in Washington, although I do use it at times, and I'll mention why we do that. Ridership increased over a 15 or 20-year period. That is true. But one of the reasons was because the price of gasoline was so much higher 15, 20 years ago. And as gas has come down, we've seen ridership come down as well. The other problem with Amtrak, as you alluded to with some of the challenges in Europe, is it's not managed very well at all. For example, last year, Amtrak lost $40 million in Coca-Cola sales. And what I mean by that, if you went to the cafe car and you wanted wine, beer, a soft drink, they would say X amount of money, you would hand it over, they would give you the drink. I don't know how, but Amtrak lost $40 million in that process last year. It's not managed very well, clearly. There are several differences, though, that I think are important, that are easier in the US when dealing with this than some of the challenges facing Europe. I mentioned the most important was this vertical integration. In Canada, in Mexico, and in the United States, the same operator can control and work throughout those three regions. And that cannot be done in Europe. And that's a very significant difference because it goes to the barriers of entry problem that you alluded to. And the other problem is that we actually, even though the US spends $1.4 billion in subsidies, it's still a relatively small share of overall transportation subsidies in other industries. What does this mean? Well, it means we actually have a greater opportunity to invest privately in our resources in transportation, and that does lead to a more efficient system. And we have fewer political actors that are as involved. I should have mentioned, every year, more and more Americans would like to see the subsidy to Amtrak go away. But there's one significant problem. The state of Delaware is located between Washington, D.C. and New York. Does anybody know where the Vice President of the United States comes from? Delaware. He was senator from Delaware for 30 or 20 years. And there was one very strong proponent of Amtrak, who happens to be the second most powerful man in the United States. And until he goes away, Amtrak is very safe. So we can't do much there. Now you have to remember, one of the key reasons for a lot of these regulatory changes in the United States, especially in train and boat and other kinds of forms, a lot had to do with environmental concerns. The intention to increase public ridership and decrease automobile use. So significant impact in the 1970s when a lot of regulation began. And this is actually a good example of how when government thinks it can control the outcomes, the opposite oftentimes happens. Now, the ridership statistics between the Europeans and the United States are relatively similar. What I mean by that is about 85% of the US citizens drive their car. About 73% of Europeans do. But a lot of the changes in increases in ridership in high-speed trains in Europe, I think, and I might be incorrect, has come from lower speed trains, not necessarily roads. And airplanes have sort of changed, depending. Obviously, air ridership in the US is very different from in Europe, but the percentages are still the same. Now, in Japan, in 1970 or 1969, when high-speed rail was introduced, had a very, very high percentage of the population rode, about 70%. What has happened now is that as a percentage of those who drive or take the trains, in Japan it's dropped to about 30%, even though it's still very crowded and still very utilized, meaning more people now drive on with cars in Japan than what was intended back in 1969. Again, it's unintended consequences. It's neither good nor bad. It's just another example of how sometimes you try to plan and the opposite may happen. The other, and you were very correct in identifying some of the challenges that a free market has in Europe. I would say of the list that you gave, the biggest challenge are the politicians. It's just, I think, to be very honest, that's the biggest challenge. Because many of the things you listed are challenges, but they can be overcome. Barriers of entry can be changed. Freeing up price systems can, in fact, utilize information more effectively. Allowing a more vertical integration structure of ownership can, in fact, increase both competition. The question is, and that's essentially a political question, is how fast do you want the change to occur? And that's only something that can be decided for good and for bad by government. But the one factor I would put into the mix that I think can change how we think about railroad transportation, and you alluded to it with trucks, is how technology is already beginning to have an effect on our own use of transportation choices. So for example, in the United States, we see, and Jose did not mention this, we've had conversations about this, driverless cars are beginning to appear on the scene. Driverless cars change, in fact, do we all now own cars, or we will be sharing cars? In Texas, there is an Uber-like company developing for transportation on trucks, a shared transportation system among trucks. The other big significance is that 5 years ago, as a Washington, D.C. resident, I could fly to New York, I could take Amtrak to New York, I could drive to New York. I could walk, but that wouldn't be terribly efficient. Those were my choices. And depending on time and price and speed, I would choose either the train or I would choose the airplane. But what has now begun to happen is for the first time this year, more gentlemen and ladies between New York and Philadelphia and Washington travel by bus than they do by train. What has happened in the last 5 or 6 years is commercial bus industry has come back onto the scene where there was no commercial bus industry for some time. And they're called megabus, they're called bulk bus. And you can take a bus that now has drinks on board, free Wi-Fi, the ability to plug in your laptop, prices that run every half hour, every hour, and if you want to go at 2 o'clock in the morning, it will only cost you $15, but you can go at 2 o'clock in the morning to New York. And more of my business associates are taking the bus, so that now there are more bus riders than trains. Now, will bus riders ever replace cars? I don't know. But the point being that technology and creativity, and free markets in particular, free up our ingenuity and our creativity to come up with alternative ways of both reducing pollution, using less cars, sharing our cars, even creating more effective trains in some ways. It doesn't mean any of the challenges that you listed are true. They are true. But the point is that they are overcomable. And one of the challenges of planning is that we get too locked into a specific outcome and we forget what can happen along the way and the creativity. And I'm reminded in closing of a wonderful quotation by Friedrich Hayek, who said, planning and competition can be combined only by planning for competition, but not by planning against competition. Rail is not perfect right now. Rail has challenges. I think the railroad industry and what the US experiences and some of the challenges in Europe shows what we both can do and what also our limitations can be, but it also shows that they are overcomable. So thank you.
I have one question to Dr. Montero and also, well, actually to all three. Do you think that the negative approach to privatization of trains is because Lady Thatcher failed in her first round when she privatized the British rail system, and she also privatized the infrastructure, but this was in such bad shape that those who bought the trains were not able to invest into this infrastructure to run it more successful, to run it. And by that, many accidents happened and it became inefficient, etc., etc. Would this be one of the reasons that there is this negative connotation, or do you see among those that you have pointed out also others?
I think that this has been a psychological effect because the media has informed about this. And it has been the opportunity for the oppositors to talk about this, but in fact, all experts know that this is not the problem. This is not the problem at all, because it was for sure that it would happen because of the special traits of the British railways. They were old, they combined many lines in the same lane. It was a complete system. It was necessary to change it, and it was for sure that this problem would appear. The real problem is that Mr. Hayek has explained it very well, that all the problems I have listed there are possible to overcome, but they need that every department involved in this problem would reach an agreement and would have a strong energy to solve these problems. And the good news is that the politicians are exhausted. As they are unable to solve the problem, they are, well, in boxing we say to tirar la toalla, and now is the opportunity that we need to solve this problem. and the politicals are unable and recognize that they cannot, it's the time to do it. And forget about the problem of the British example, because it was forecasted before, no problem.
I have a very good friend of mine who I used to work with named Maurice McTeague. Maurice was the Minister of Transport for New Zealand. He loves to tell the story that when he became the Minister of Transport, I would call it transportation, but he can call it transport, he had 37,000 employees, rail, trucks, ships. He was the last man to turn the lights out on the Ministry of Transport. He was the last employee because all of those were privatized. But did that mean 37,000 people lost their jobs? No. It simply meant that they were transferred because of the ownership change into a different kind of opportunity. That story is not just told, but it reflects the fact that when we hear privatization, human beings do not like to change. That's just a reality. We're uncomfortable with that. And so when we hear that, especially for an industry that has been dominated by the state for so many decades, that is so institutionalized in a mentality for those who work there, it is nothing but fear and is nothing but change. I can be sympathetic, but at the end of the day, that is what puts the pressure on the politicians. When they hear the word privatization, they don't understand that that actually means opportunity.
Yeah. I would like to add a couple of points. Sometimes it could be maybe ingenuous to think that a sector with such few operators could work effectively and could work with competing against each other, because sometimes we see that in these sectors where there are 2 or 3 players, some agreements about prices may come along, and the effects of the free market are being jeopardized. This from one side. From the other, I recall a comment that was made one time by the mayor of Barcelona about the port of Barcelona, which is a major asset of Catalonia, which receive a lot of goods, and these goods have to be properly channeled and transported and taken away from the port. And I think that for many years it was required a proper railroad connection to exit the goods, and the situation was being cleared. But the comments of the mayor were in the line that, okay, we have solved this connection problem, but now we have to convince the entrepreneurs to use the train, because it may be possible that entrepreneurs, businessmen, prefer to use the truck instead of the train.
This is a matter of price. This is a matter of market. If the infrastructure is badly designed, the operation is badly managed, and the system doesn't work, the clients go to the truck. This is what happened.
Yeah. Barbara and Jose mentioned rule of law earlier. When it comes to entrepreneurs coming into either trucks or railroad, that's a role for government, is to be very clear on what the ownership rules would be. Because entrepreneurs like to experiment and explore, but they also need to understand what's expected and where the opportunities are. And certainly, government could reduce the barriers to allow certain flexibility to encourage entrepreneurs to let their creative energies go. But they will also need to know that their investment would be protected, and not 5 or 10 years later, it would be brought back to the government control.
I have to answer this question taking into account rough figures. First, in America, more or less, the participation of the railways in cargo is 40%, more or less.
For converted trucks. Yeah.
Yeah. In Europe, is in average 20%. Taking into account that in Europe there are 10 or 15% more by channels, by chips on channels. In Spain, where there are no channels, our participation is 5%, 4%. And in Russia is 60%. If we take into account that every container moved by train lasts 20% of the energy of the truck, you can imagine that this is for sure that something wrong is on the air. And this something wrong is on the air is that in Europe, because of technical reasons, because of the lack of standardization, this makes impossible to move easily trains from across barriers. One country, everybody of us think that, for example, Belgium and Holland belong more or less to the same country and so on. Not from the point of view of the train, because if you have traveled there, you will discover, surprisingly, that crossing the barriers needs changing the train on foot. So America has solved the problem of the cargo, or of the freight, between Mexico, Canada, and United States, which is the same country. And in Europe, we have been unable to do easier things among 25 countries, which are 25 different systems. First of all, standardization, and then we will go step by step to solve the problem. But the problem is possible to be solved, is what I wanted to say to you. And if somebody of you is in doubt, please buy this, this book.
Thank you. Yes, exactly. That's free market, really free market. Free market in action.